Welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, where I teach educated, successful couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships so that you can stop compromising and start feeling fully alive in your relationship. I'm Alexandra Stockwell, aka the Intimacy Doctor. I'm a physician, a relationship and intimacy coach, and I'm an intimate marriage expert. My husband and I have been married for 26 years. We have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing marriage. I've shown hundreds of couples how to do so as well. So if you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place. I will show you how. Now, let's dive in. Welcome back, sweetheart. I'm so glad my husband, Rod Stockwell, is here for this conversation today.
Hello. It's good to be back.
Yeah, actually, we've tried recording this episode before, but we kind of messed up the recording, which means that we've already gone kind of deep into the topic, and that always means that there are going to be new things that will emerge. So I'm excited to proceed.
But I like the general theme of every time as if it's the first time.
Yes, exactly, which really is an important teaching that, honestly, I think I've needed to learn and implement more than you, but it means that if I want you to do something, if I want you to take the trash out, or I want you to touch me in a particular way, or I want you to pay attention while I speak, or anything else.
Any request,
if I've made it and you haven't done it, then it's frustrating and I have to make it again. And by the 8th time, it has a certain bite to it, which really does not make it appealing to actually do what I'm asking you to do. Thus, each time as though it's the first time. And that doesn't mean that we're giving a free pass to the person who is going to do the task. But it does mean that being in the present moment, asking as though it's the first time, is going to lead to a greater likelihood that you're going to be glad to go ahead and do the thing.
Right. It from the receiver's point of view of receiving a request, it makes it much easier to say yes when it doesn't have that bite behind it or the baggage of previous episodes. It's just a request.
Yeah. And, I think that this sometimes happens with the children where, let's say one of our kids is immersed in a book and I'll say, hey, it's time to set the table because we're going to be eating soon and there's nothing, or maybe, and then, hey, it's time to set the table. Come on. And then eventually I'll say, come on, the table needs to be set. And they'll look up and say, why are you yelling at me? And it's like, I've asked you, 3 times already, why isn't this happening? And I've learned to believe the child who says, no, this is the first time you're asking me because I didn't actually get their attention before. Now, in that scenario, clearly asking each time as though it's the first time is not going to lead to success because they're not perceiving it. There are other adjustments to make, but that's just a kind of familiar situation where when the person making the request, their intensity and resentment and sense of being unheard and rejected just brings this nasty element into the conversation.
Yeah, and I suppose when it's a request amongst equals, it's a little bit different than when it's a request of a child or someone that you're the boss of or something.
Yeah.
If they don't hear you, it's different.
Yes, and I actually think that's very relevant because particularly for a woman who's making multiple requests of her husband and not getting a response, we can then feel like we're in a parental role, which is singularly unhelpful and diminishes the turn on and erotic energy in a couple when one of them is parental, unless you're choosing that for role play, which can have its positive function, but not when daily life feels that way.
Exactly.
All right. Well, now that we've riffed on that topic, and we'll do this episode as though it's the first time, even though for us it isn't. What we're actually going to speak about is problem solving. And I'm going to set the context. But before I do, is there anything that you want to say? How do you feel about an episode focused on problem solving?
I'm good with it. It's a question of timing. That's my theme of the answer.
Okay, great. So when I'm coaching couples, these are couples who are high-level, successful people who know how to make things happen, who know how to get things done in their lives, except when it comes to their intimate relationship, to their marriage, then many of the same communication styles and skill sets that work so well for professional success don't end up working as well or creating the same results, positive results in the relationship. So one of the things that invariably comes up when I'm coaching a couple is to pay attention to what type of conversation or communication you're having. Sometimes I'll have the couple make a list of the different kinds. Sometimes I'll make it. But on that list, there's going to be venting, making a request, problem solving, a vulnerable communication, just sitting together in silence and letting things just be the way they are, complaining about things happening at work. There really are so many different kinds initiating sex. There are a lot of different kinds of communications. And in my opinion, one of the things that causes a kind of unnecessary tension and dissatisfaction, actually another type of communication which has its merits is conflict as well. But anyway, the point is that each of these has its function. And if one person is making one kind of communication and the other is making another, that really causes disconnection, frustration, disappointment, loneliness, not feeling seen and heard. It really is a major source of problems. And so to be really concrete,
Well, I just want to give an example because from my own point of view, I really had trouble telling the difference when you were wanting to have a communication which was venting or sharing your feelings versus when you had a problem solving, like this is a problem that's coming up and I'd love your thoughts about how to solve it. And I think I tended to think we were having a problem solving conversation when actually, from your point of view, that wasn't your goal at all. You were wanting instead to just share your feelings about something. And so I had a totally different job in those two kinds of conversations.
Yeah, so let's get even more concrete with the example. So let's say I've just come in the door and I put the groceries down and I say, do you have a minute to talk? And you say yes. And I proceed to describe this phone call that I've just had, which is really upsetting to me because I expected someone to do something and they haven't done it. And I just am feeling really frustrated and emotional about the whole situation. So you respond with some perfectly reasonable suggestions for what I might do differently or how I might handle it or what I could do to avoid that happening in the future or what actions I should take with the person that I was talking to on the phone in order to resolve the situation. And how do I respond when you do that?
No, I'll pretty much bite my head off.
That's right. Because
it's so unsatisfying to you for what you thought the goal of the communication was.
Right, because from my perspective, I've had this experience and I want to share it with you in order to not feel alone in this complicating circumstance. And so I tell you about it, and I'm really yearning for you to just feel it with me or be there, witness, understand, have compassion, and you're coming with solutions. And I, at first, would feel confused, like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing giving me a solution? There is a problem, but that's not where my focus is. My focus is on my experience. So I think any couple can imagine some version of this, even if there's not as much emotion. Maybe it's also where I want to pick a paint color for a room, and I say to you, I'm trying to decide between mauve and off-white. And you say, okay, well, good luck. But what I really wanted was to know which one you prefer. But I didn't actually tell you that. And you have learned not to give your opinion unless I've asked for it. And so that is frustrating.
That's the opposite scenario.
The opposite scenario. And then I'm left thinking, well, don't you care? Don't you care what color the room is? You're going to be in it with me. How come you don't care? Aren't you invested in our life together? Don't you care about me? Do you want to be married to me? All of that can be in my saying, I'm trying to decide between mauve and off-white, and you say, oh, well, yeah, good luck. I hope you decide soon. So the thing I'm really wanting to point to here is that the source of so many communications is what I'll call false expectations. Not creating a situation where there is a win-win, where you both know what kind of communication you want to have. Because once that's the case and you learn how to have a variety of communications in a healthy, successful way, well, none of these humorous situations ever drive you crazy.
Yeah, and it's remarkable how many actually different types of communication conversations there are. And at least from my point of view, how often in the past we were not in sync. Like we were having two different conversations and we didn't even know it because we weren't being deliberate about what we wanted to have that conversation be.
Yeah, and I think that you and I are so used to this reality of wanting to set things up as a win-win where we're both participating in the same kind of conversation that as soon as things start to get a little kooky, one of us will say, what kind of conversation did you think we were having? But
I catch it much faster than I used to. It's like, oh, we're not having the same conversation right now.
Yeah. Did you think we were problem solving? So anyway, all of this is fun to share, but I'm still setting up the topic for today's episode because I do a version of this kind of teaching in a very customized way that's relevant to the particular couple I'm coaching. And I usually focus a lot on how to use conflict to enhance connection, how to have vulnerable communications that really deepen emotional intimacy, how to set things up to vent in a way that works for both of you. And when I'm going through the different types of conversations and teaching couples how to have them well, I usually just say, and then there's problem solving and move on to the next one. And I'm currently coaching this fabulous couple. They are both so educated, so competent, so respected in their professional circumstances. And when we started working together, there was a lot of disconnection between them that is really resolved, and they have a beautiful way of communicating with one another that's really satisfying for both of them. And the man in this couple, who is a total go-getter, action taker, left brain person who's had a lot of success from being that way, came back to me after one of our sessions and said, you know, how do you suggest we do problem solving? Like, what's the key to successful problem solving? And interestingly, I haven't been asked that question before, but I think it's such a great question. So I answered him, but I also thought all of you listening might like to hear how Rod and I set up problem solving conversations so that they're really successful.
Absolutely. And obviously, from everything we've been saying up until now, the first thing is both of you knowing and agreeing that you're in a problem-solving conversation.
Right. So whoever brings up the topic, you want to be clear, let's have a problem-solving conversation. And let me just say that
I have this problem, and I'd love your thoughts about it.
Yeah, although for things that are really at least emotionally complicated, usually you're going to want to have a vulnerable communication first. And once you're on the same page, you both feel seen and heard on that topic, then you can deliberately transition into having a problem-solving conversation. Other times, we might just start with that.
Well, it's easiest when the problem, like, let's say it's a problem in my work environment. And so you may not even know the people involved, and I'm giving you the information about what the situation is. And then we can kind of sit down together and look at the facts and talk about your thoughts and my thoughts about it. That's easier than when the problem is at home or, between the two of us or something like that.
Because we each have our own experiences, and so we're not going to necessarily right off the bat be on the same page. And so in that scenario, it's super important to have a vulnerable conversation where we get to emotionally align and at least be clear what are the different variables that are going to need attention.
Right. I think of that as like getting everything out on the table so that we can look at what's in you and what's in me, and all of that information about what the problem actually is clear.
Yeah. So once all of that is set up, I feel like it would be helpful to have a specific example, but let's just say that once everything is set up, then what are the elements as you see it that contribute to a problem-solving conversation being successful, which often means being efficient? Not that it has to be quick, but there's no landmines or undesired detours where suddenly we're negotiating all kinds of emotional stuff. We can just stay focused on problem solving.
Right. Like, so let's say that the problem is that the garbage in the kitchen needs to be taken out and put in the bin. But from my point of view, I feel like I do it all the time, and I want help with it sometimes or whatever. I have a little bit of charge about it, and you have charge about if it gets smelly or it doesn't get smelly or, whatever. And to you, it means that I don't love you if I don't take it out. Like everybody can have different baggage around it. It's not really only about the garbage and what happens to it. So getting all that stuff out on the table first makes it easier to then have a conversation just about, well, and what are we going to actually do about making sure this task happens?
Yeah, although I would adjust something. Yes, we can get everything out on the table, and then we need to give attention to the emotional elements first. And really only once all of that has happened are we even in a position to actually problem solve on the practical element, because in some ways I could say we've already addressed the other elements. So now we're left with just the practical, logistical elements. who's going to pick them up how are we going to get the trash out on Tuesdays when you work late?
And the truth is that doing the emotional processing of me really hearing your point of view and you really hearing my point of view and fleshing that out so we both understand each other's relationship to the thing can be the bigger issue. The practical logistical discussion can be really simple once that other stuff has actually happened.
Yeah. And the way that I would put it is, if you feel frustrated, if you feel like there's a lot of friction and resistance, then there's probably something that needs attention before you actually are in a problem-solving conversation, because that should feel fairly well lubricated. You're going to use both of your intelligence and information about the situation, clear on what the goal is, and it's just a question of how you're going to go from where you are to that goal being met. So,
yeah, and the goal is to kind of both be sitting next to each other looking at the problem together so that it's clear that you can use your creativity on it to figure out what to do.
Yeah, so if it feels like, to make this more visual, you're at one end of the table and your spouse is at the other end of the table, and the problem is in the middle, meaning your spouse is seeing certain things and you're seeing certain things, then it can feel almost like a tug of war to try to make the thing happen. But if instead you're sitting side by side and the problem is in front of you and you can see the same things, you might prioritize different elements, but you can look at it together, be clear what the challenge is, what needs to be resolved, and the outcome that you want to have. And once it's set up that way, then typically you have what you need to either solve the problem or identify what else is necessary to solve the problem. So if problem solving feels difficult, convoluted, unpredictable, you're actually not having the right kind of conversation for the issue at hand.
And another way that I would say that is, when you're sitting on either end of the table, often it feels like you're fighting about whose point of view is right and whose is wrong. And there's a winner and a loser, and you're on opposite sides. And that's actually not a good way to problem solve. When you're both sitting on the same side of the table looking at the problem, then it's not about one person being right or wrong. There's various perspectives. You can look at the problem from anywhere around the table. It's really about, okay, now that we have all this information, let's think about how we're going to address this particular issue together.
Yeah, and it may be that we both look at something and it's just obvious what to do, and other times, as a result of discussing it, again, calmly, with mutual respect and a strong sense of being on the same team, then just discussing it that way, we can come up with solutions that really are so much better than what either one of us would have done on our own, or either one of us would have had access to if there were all of these kind of emotional, psychological, energetic complications that cloud our view of whatever the topic is at hand.
Right. And I find that if, as I give suggestions or you give suggestions, and then there's a lot of resistance to it and struggle about the suggestions, then we have to go back to the previous step of clearing the emotional air before we can get to the actual solving of the problem.
Right. And if I'm getting the feeling, I just should do this myself, that's another indicator that we really didn't prepare the soil to be having a problem-solving conversation. There's something else that needs attention, although it can happen, of course, that we set ourselves up well for a problem-solving conversation, but then we need to take a detour because something has arisen partway through, and then return to the problem solving. And I really want to emphasize that if that arises, you again want to be really clear. You know what? Let's do a little timeout on problem solving. I have something that needs attention first, and then come back to it. And
like adjusting my stool.
Yes.
if my balance is off.
Yes, exactly. And which is something that just happened while we were recording, which is why you use that example. And I guess the thing I want to say is that this sounds like a lot of talking and a lot of processing and a lot of analyzing. And I am not a fan of that at all. And it is not how we live. Like, we're pretty efficient and fairly joyful in going from one kind of conversation to the next. It's like we're fluent in that language. And it really does feel like a language to learn. And so in this conversation that we're having, we're like reviewing basic grammar and basic vocabulary, and it can feel very cumbersome. But when you put into action just the very simple steps of clarifying what kind of a communication you're having and how best to do that, it actually flows fairly easily, and it does not feel like analysis paralysis or processing ad nauseum. It actually feels super efficient, like being fluent in a language as opposed to early grammar lessons.
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
I would say it's a skill. So the point is that when we weren't doing it well, it would turn into a fight or an argument. And it felt like we were having the same argument over and over again, once a week or every day. And once we got skillful, once we took the time to do it slow the first few times and separate the different parts, then now it's so efficient because we know exactly the terrain and how to do it. And it happens much, much, much faster.
Yeah. And the times that we didn't end up fighting and having an argument, we would each be licking our wounds and building resentment. So whatever time it takes to learn these skills is such an incredible investment with an ROI of unspeakable proportions, because not only are your communications successful, but you have all this energy and attention that isn't in a kind of sinkhole because you feel isolated or you're fighting or you're not able to actually get to the solutions you want.
Yeah, and I would say it's the advantage is that it winds up building connection because you've successfully solved another problem together and seen each other more clearly in how you were relating to that problem, as opposed to it creating disconnection where you just feel resentful that we can't get anywhere and we're having the same argument again.
Yeah, and so that level of connection, emotional intimacy really enhances communications we have with one another in a day-to-day way. It obviously enhances everything else going on in life because you don't have this like albatross of complicated connection and communication with your spouse that you're dragging around all day. And it certainly means more time for interactions where we're not speaking because our mouths and the rest of us are engaged in other activities with one another.
Absolutely.
So I think we'll end there with just a call to figure out your problem solving. And when you do, it will mean that you have figured out so much else as well. And of course, if you want help with that, if you want efficient, clear, successful help with that, definitely contact me, because this is one of the most gratifying things that I do with couples is teach them how to have the kinds of communications they want to be having. The rewards in doing so are so much better than you can imagine. So you can click on a link in the show notes to contact me, or go to my website, alexandrastockwell.com, and fill out the contact form. Because if you know how to do this already, then you know how great it is. And if you don't, I promise you it will be worth it.
Absolutely.